Thank you guys for coming out tonight. My name is Marc Hays. Married to Jamie for nearly 16 years, and we have 6 children, a set of triplets, a set of twins, and a single birth, which is a long story you can ask me about later. Some of you already know it even. I'm a Challenge 1 and 2 director with Classical Conversations in Hartsville, Tennessee, and I'm a land surveyor by trade, and I'm an elder at St. Mark Reformed Church in Brentwood, Tennessee, and I'm overall just a general lover of everything CC, and the Hayses are truly blessed to be a part of Classical Conversations, and I rejoice in the opportunity to be able to share some of that with you tonight. To briefly go over what we're going to do tonight, I have an acquaintance named Dr. George Grant. Perhaps some of you may be familiar with him. And he has a lecture that he gave that just inspired me the first few times I heard it. And I shared it with other people and got some good responses, some good questions, and there's a lot of insight in it. And so I have asked Dr. Grant if I could do a lengthy quote of his, and he said that would be fine. So the first portion of what we're doing tonight is a 20-minute segment of one of Dr. Grant's lectures. And then after that, we'll move into an explanation of Classical Conversations via their alliteration of classical Christian community. And we'll elaborate on each one of those for the duration of the hour. And so I'll get in character and give you guys my best Dr. Grant. These were meant to go with my intro. There's some of my students from over the years. We're usually serious all the time, smiling. Here's Dr. Grant, if you don't know him. He's founder of New College Franklin down in Franklin, Tennessee. So as your children go through their high school years eventually and look toward college perhaps, there are options that are liberal arts educational options. You don't have to resolve yourself to the local community college. You may end up there, but you don't have to resolve yourself to it. There are opportunities to continue classical education right here in the Nashville area. The title of Dr. Grant's lecture is The Begats, The Genealogy of Classical Christian Education. This is available on wordmp3.com if you want to hear him do it. I think it's even one of the free downloads on WordMP3. All right, that's later. All right, so my best George Grant. Now what we're going to do is a major flyby in this session. What we're going to attempt to accomplish is to survey the entire history of classical Christian education from the time of Moses to the present in 8 minutes or less. So please fasten your seat belts. Make sure your seat backs and tray tables are in their upright and locked positions, because we're about to take off on the nose of a 747 on a winter's day into a headwind out of the Baltimore airport and into the dangerous and treacherous realms of the Atlantic. You know, I've thought a lot about the remarkable work that God is doing in your lives and in your communities and in our day. And I'm so thankful for the work that He's doing in our day. But we are the heirs of a rich legacy in history. So as we begin this evening, let's invoke God's purposes and God's providence in our work as we look back at the works of others who have come before us. Now, in the beginning, of course, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Through Him were all things made, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was light, and in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. Long ago, in sundry and diverse ways, God spoke to our fathers through many witnesses that He sent to bear witness about that light, that all might believe. And thus came Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And thus came Moses, and Joshua, and Gideon. And thus came David, and Solomon, and Josiah. And thus came Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. Thus came the judges, the kings, and the prophets. Now they were not that light, of course, but they were sent to bear witness about that light, that all might believe. And in these last days, the Father has spoken to us through His Son, through whom He created the world, whom He has appointed heir of all things. And now the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have beheld His glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and of truth. And though the Gospels record much of the doings of this Jesus, were all of them to be written, well, I suppose the world itself would not contain the books therein. The apostles, Peter, James, and John, Matthew, Philip, and Bartholomew, Thaddeus, Judas, and the others, were begotten by grace through faith, and this not of themselves. Their disciples, in turn, were begotten by the gospel from Pentecost through the patristic age. And thus came Basil, and Chrysostom, and Gregory Nazianzus. And thus came Athanasius, Jerome, and Anselm. We're building our timeline of classical educators. And thus came Augustine of Hippo, father of Western civilization. Augustine begat the great medievals, Boethius, Cassiodorus, and Boniface, and Bede, Anselm, and Gregory. The medievals begat the great scholastics, Aquinas, and Abelard, and Bonaventure. And in due course, across time, they begat the brethren of the common life, the Grutta, and Suela, and Kempis, and with them was birthed the morning stars of the Reformation, Wycliffe, and Jerome, and Huss. And then in turn, just 3 generations later, they begat the magisterial reformers, Luther, and Zwingli, and Butzer, Calvin, Beza, and Knox. The reformers begat the Puritans, and the Covenanters, and Jan Amos Comenius. And then behold, a new vision of freedom was begotten, the great experiment of liberty in America. And likewise, Chalmers and Daubigny begat Van Prinsterer, who begat Kuyper, who begat Van Til, who begat Schaeffer, who begat us. A long and glorious line, rich and often interrupted, but never quite silenced, a testimony of goodness and truth and beauty from God Almighty across the ages and into your abecedarian classroom, in your town, in our day. And of course, in such a survey, we skim over much. We skip through the greats of the patristic age and the medieval age, of Milton and Kew, and of Rutherford and Edwards, of Chesterton and Sayers. And yet, the answer is, or the lesson is clear, is it not? God has, from the beginning, called upon His people to live out lives of beauty and goodness and truth, so as to ensure covenantal succession, to disciple the coming generations, to bestow upon them the richness of the gospel legacy, the transforming work of the good news in every arena of life, so that not one discipline, not one area, not one smidge of life is left untouched by the regency of the Lord Jesus Christ. You can go all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and there find in the Shema, that great declaration of faith in the Old Testament, the beginnings of classical Christian education. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Here we see, right from the beginning, that the bequest that we are to entrust to the coming generations, to our children, is to be a bequest that begins with a theological bias. The Lord God Himself is the center point, and ultimately the integration point of all other things. And Moses goes on to declare, These words shall be on your heart, a literary bias. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, a didactic bias. And you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up, a covenantal bias. And you shall bind them on head and hand and house and gate, an aesthetic bias. And then concluding the whole long section, Moses says to the people of Israel, "Now in times to come, when your son comes to you and asks you, 'What is the meaning of these commandments and these statutes and these testimonies that the Lord our God has given us?' Then you shall say to your sons, 'We were once slaves in Egypt.' And you will tell your sons of the great and mighty works of the Lord across the ages, in time and in space and in your lives," an historical bias. And from the time of the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, all across the ages and through the tumults of Jewish history and into the age of the New Covenant and the birthing of the church, there was this sense that centered on the Lord, integrating all things in our knowledge and our understanding of Him, of His providence and of His goodness, that we are to convey the truth that words matter, that diligence is required, and that the covenant is the means and the way by which covenantal succession will spread to the ends of the earth. That there is an aesthetic that is objective. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, and this can all be seen through the lens of history. This has been passed on from generation to generation, and this is the essence of classical Christian education. We see this reflected in the New Testament, in the great integration point of these truths in Philippians chapter 4. I call this the curriculum of righteousness. This is when the Apostle Paul says, "Now this is what I want you to study. This is what I want you to think about. This is what I want you to wrestle with for the rest of your lives. Herein lies the great curriculum of the Christian life. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honorable, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever is pure, whatsoever is lovely, whatsoever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think on these things." Is it any wonder then that these early Christians began to cast about and wonder how they could raise up the next generation of Christian leaders without falling into the same old traps of the Greek and Roman rhetoricians and philosophers of their own day? And essentially, Augustine of Hippo is the one that we credit with wrestling with these details and systematically laying out for us what would ultimately become the trivium and the quadrivium. Having rejected Roman classical education, having seen the pitfalls of Manichaeanism and Neoplatonism in his own life, seeing the shipwreck that it brought him to, he began to think about the glorious fulfillment of God's promises to be faithful into 1,000 generations, and to raise up a glorious new flowering of art and music and literature and ideas that are ultimately reflective of the gospel and not of our own human pride and aspirations. He began to systemize this into what we know of as a Christian and classical education. His idea was that there needed to be some sort of arch axiom, a fortress of first principles, in order to raise up children in the way that they should go, to fear God, to grow in wisdom, and to change the world. Across the ages, Augustinians brought flower to the Western world, and thus were birthed the sundry universities and the scholastic system that marked the West, and brought about the remarkable opportunity for freedom and prosperity for which the West ultimately became known. But if you know your history, you know that the victories of Western Christendom were short-lived and well-contained, racked by the tumults of controversy and divisiveness, of corruption, and ultimately of perverse immorality. And thus by the 14th century, the age of the 100 Years' War and the bubonic plague and the Hanseatic League and the Babylonian captivity of the church, God raised up through a handful of Augustinians a fresh new wind of hope under Gerhard Grote and the Brethren of Common Life schools. The Devotio Moderna, the idea of recovering the richness of righteousness and goodness, along with beauty and truth. And this man, Gerhard Grote, he was a wealthy, noble fool who met Christ dramatically, and it changed his life forever. He began to gather to himself a handful of orphans left stranded on the shores of an inhospitable culture by the bubonic plague. And he began to pour into them the riches of Western literature and the traditions of Christian holiness. In time, his disciples scattered and established similar houses throughout all of Europe, and thus Gerhard Zerbold and John Soleil and Thomas à Kempis carried on the rich tradition of one master pouring into a handful of students, loving what they loved in front of those that they loved. It was a little movement, hardly noticed by the grand establishment of the day, flying under the radar of the scholastics and the academics, and yet lasting legacy ensued, because, you see, Martin Luther went to a Brethren of Common Life school. Philip Melanchthon went to a Brethren of Common Life school. When he was a boy, Ulrich Zwingli went to a Brethren of Common Life school, as did Martin Bucer and Theodore Beza and John Calvin. And thus was birthed the magisterial Reformation in just 3 generations. Each of these magisterial reformers went on to establish his own little academies. And to read the words of Luther and Beza and Calvin on education is stunning to us today, because they reflect so much of our own concerns, of our own interests, and of the overwhelming obstacles that we think that we face. They, in a day of smothering uniformity, they most assuredly faced. And thus were birthed the little academies, which ultimately gave rise to the Puritans and the Covenanters, and that would breathe new life into old medieval institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, and that would ultimately raise up in exile communities like those of the Moravians, men like Jan Amos Comenius, who thought long and hard as he traveled far and wide with a vagabond people, exiled from their homeland following the 30 Years' War, about what it would mean to preserve the inheritance of the Christian tradition for future generations. His book, The School of Infancy, laid the groundwork for what he called the Pansophic Collegium, which became the basis for the ideas of ongoing education at Cambridge and throughout Sweden and Denmark, and then across the waters to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and was shaping the thinking of the American founders. It's a long and glorious line, a rich legacy that was often interrupted but never quite silenced, and giving rise in the end to great heroes like Arthur Quiller Couch and G.K. Chesterton, to C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, to John Buchan and T.S. Eliot, and to Dorothy Sayers and Douglas Wilson, and might I add, to Leigh Bortins. And as you consider the begats and your role in the continuation of what God began, you may be wondering, as you consider your role, you may be wondering, how do I fit in? I'm not Moses. I'm not Paul. I'm not a prophet. I'm not an apostle. I'm not a bishop like Augustine, nor am I a genius like Aquinas, or rich like Grote. But what Dr. Grant wanted us to see in his long list of begats was that these were not great men from the beginning. These were not born educational reformers. These were men who did not start out as great. Moses was a shepherd in exile. Paul was a persecutor of the church. Augustine was a marginalized bishop in North Africa. Luther was a parish priest in Saxony. We know their names today because God called them unto a task, and they heeded that call. They invested what God had given them in the lives of the people that God had placed around them, and God blessed their faithfulness. And in due course, I had a big question mark to come up. How do I fit in? There's your big question mark. And in due course, in the middle of the 20th century, a group of Christian classicists gathered in England, in the Oxford area, and they wrote their essays, and they wrote their stories, and they taught their students. And men like J.R.R. Tolkien, he's one of the greats to us today. But he was laughed at by his fellow professors for his children's stories. And C.S. Lewis, he was a Don at Oxford. That sounds pretty good, but he never got his Ph.D. And what about Dorothy Sayers? Who is she? Dorothy Sayers was a fiction writer, a mystery writer who wrote fiction in order to pay the bills so that she could set time aside to translate Dante. She loved Dante, and so she translated the Divine Comedy and paid the bills with her fiction writing. And Dorothy Sayers, in 1947, gave a lecture at Oxford, which was transcribed into an essay called The Lost Tools of Learning. And in this essay, she applies the classical trivium of grammar and dialectic and rhetoric, which we'll talk about more later. She applies the three arts of the trivium to the stages of childhood development. And then after learning the trivium, the student would go on to learn the quadrivium, and thus complete the 7 liberal arts and acquire classical education. In The Lost Tools of Learning, she made application of these insights that she had into the trivium. And she also doubted whether anyone would ever try it. However, sometime in the mid-1970s, a young sailor named Douglas Wilson read a reprint of that article in the National Review. And in the early 80s, he had a daughter that was ready to begin school. And so he began a school in Moscow, Idaho. And as he and the board convened to decide how the school was going to be run and what direction it was going to go, what foundation it was going to be built on, they said, let's use Sayers' model from this 1947 essay as our application of the classical trivium. And in Douglas Wilson's words, he said over the next decade, he watched it catch fire in the student. And the prophecies that Sayer made, in a sense, he saw them manifest in the students. Her insights worked when applied. Fast forward a little more into the 1990s, and there's Douglas Wilson. Fast forward to the 1990s, and there's a homeschool mom in North Carolina named Leigh Bortins, who took what she had learned from those who had come before her, and she developed a plan to help moms and dads apply the collective educational wisdom of the ages to home education. And so we're here today because of the insight of Augustine and Cassiodorus. And we're here today because of the insight of Grote and Comenius, and because of the insight of Sayers and Wilson. And we're here tonight because of the insight of Leigh Bortins. And so what did she do? What did she do that was so unique that it has resulted in over 81,000 classical conversation students being classically educated this year at home? Well, that's just it. She took classical education and she brought it home. But in doing that, she recognized that for all that can happen at home in our children's education, not all of it is supposed to happen there. In Leigh's book, Echoing's Celebration, she coins the term home-centered education, The home is the headquarters, but the entire world is the classroom. And not just the world around us in our own day, but the world through the ages. So we are home schoolers. We are home educators. And if you miss that at the beginning of a discussion about classical conversations, then a lot about it won't make sense. Because we are home educators, and it works when people are home educating. And if you just don't miss that starting out and think that this is supposed to look like a private day school or like a public run school, because it's not, and it doesn't work that way. So we are homeschoolers, but we're homeschoolers in the sense that the home is the center, not the extent of our children's education. And this is where classical conversations enters into the long line of the begats. In order to think about classical conversations, we could begin by asking ourselves a few simple questions. Questions of definition like, what is classical conversations? Or what is classical conversations not? We just discussed that a little bit. What is the essence of classical conversations? Or what are the defining characteristics? And these will be the questions that we're going to endeavor to answer over the rest of the lecture. What are the defining characteristics? The overarching vision of classical conversations is to equip and support homeschoolers in cultivating a love of learning in order to know God and to make Him known. These defining characteristics are often delineated by a threefold alliteration: classical Christian community. And for a portion of the rest of our time, I'd like to zoom in on each of the three C's, on classical and on Christian and on community, that we may better understand the role of classical conversations in the begats. So first we have classical. Classical conversations is classical. Well, that's not surprising, eh? It's kind of in the name. But although folks are not surprised to hear that we're classical, they often have questions about what that means, right? We can say the word classical, especially a word like that, could be pretty vague to most people. They're going to get visions of Plato and Aristotle and togas and laurel wreaths and Parthenons and statues of Greek gods in their heads. And rightly so. That's part of the classical age. But that, of course, is not the essence. That is not the defining characteristic of classical conversations. I don't even own a toga, right? Chris does. But that's another story. But my favorite response to the question, what do I mean by classical, is that we're looking back in order to move forward. We're looking back in order to move forward. In chapter 5 of book 1 of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis said, "We all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man." We've all seen this when doing arithmetic. When I have started a sum the wrong way, the sooner I admit this and go back and start again, the faster I shall get on. Looking back in order to move forward. Classical in this sense does not mean antiquarian. Older is not necessarily better. But if an ancient practice has been successful for centuries, if it is tried and true, and the current practice has been deemed a failure in less than a century, then perhaps the wise educator would commit the latter model to the flames and pursue the former post-haste. And so under these terms, that the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man, under those terms, the reinstitution of the classical model is just good science. If we want to move beyond the monstrosity of American education, if we want to move beyond the education that we received, then we need to find out where we went wrong. And we need to go back and make the correction in order to move forward profitably. In America, this wrong turning culminated with the implementation of John Dewey's socialistic, humanistic philosophies into the public education system. It culminated with that. John Dewey is not Satan incarnate, but there was a trajectory in which America was pointed, and John Dewey was the cherry on top that pushed American education beyond what was retrievable for the model that he instituted. So if we take Lewis's advice and we look further back than Dewey, if we look further back than Marx and Darwin and Freud, if we look much further back than these wrong turnings, what do we find? Well, we look all the way back, as we've mentioned already a couple times, to Augustine and Boethius and Cassiodorus, who systemized what are known as the 7 liberal arts. These arts were part of an educator's scope and sequence long before Augustine. You find these in Plato. You find these in Pythagoras. But as far as in the foundation, moving forward up to the present day, it was systemized by Augustine and Boethius and Cassiodorus. So we have the 7 liberal arts. And we also have what are known as the servile arts. We heard this term, the liberal arts and the servile arts. For all you Henley Latin students out there, pretty early on you learn servus, servi, which means servant or slave. And the servile arts come from that Latin root, speaking of the arts that any worker would need to get through his day, whether you're a slave or whether you're a land surveyor or whether you're a construction worker or whether you're a farmer or whether you're an engineer or architect. You're still talking about what you need to know to accomplish the task, right? Those are the servile arts. Sometimes the menial arts is what they're coined. So you see the servile arts all the way back to Aristotle, these distinctions being made between liberal and servile arts. And we have the liberal arts. Once again, from the Latin, liber, libera, liberum. Take a stab at what that means. Liberty, free. It's an adjective that describes something as free. And the liberal arts were the arts that were taught to free men and to the sons of free men. A much stronger distinction in most of the centuries leading up to ours, the distinction between free and slave. We'll go into what the liberal arts are here a little bit. Concerning the 7 liberal arts, in her book, The Question, Leigh Bortins states it this way. Classical education consists of teaching the 7 liberal arts that have been instrumental in the formation of Western civilization. The trivium arts, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, allow us to grapple with words. The trivium engages us in the realm of ideas and abstractions. And then there's the quadrivium arts, algebra or arithmetic, geometry, harmonics, which includes and is focused on music, and astronomy. These give us a deeper numerical understanding of what we began in the trivium and allow us to subdue the creation, to subdue the universe. The quadrivium enables us to engage in the concrete reality. So together, the trivium, the 3, and the quadrivium, the 4, make up the 7 liberal arts. They form what are also known as the humanities, the arts that make us human. The freedom of the liberal arts comes as students acquire the skills of learning while studying the content of the subjects. To reduce an education to the acquisition of the skills that you need to get a job, as is often talked about today. To reduce education to the acquisition of the skills you need to get a job, instead of the skills you need to learn any subject, is to give our children an education that prepares them to be slaves. And this is not to say that the servile arts are bad and the liberal arts are good. It is good to work with your hands, right? We want our children to know how to sweep the floor, make their bed, do the laundry, wash the dishes, change the oil in the car, right? All of these things would be servile arts. And this is part of the Christian inheritance that we pass on, an ability, and even to instill in the desire to work with your hands. But that's only part of the inheritance that we have to pass on. Another part of the Christian inheritance is a desire and an ability to take every thought captive, right? The ideas and the abstractions of reality. To take intellectual dominion of the earth. To use their imagination to solve complex problems. To acquire tools for leadership. To gain knowledge and understanding and wisdom. There is a freedom that comes when your mind is freed from the requirement of thinking what everybody else thinks, of only having the capacity to take what's handed to you, and not to build on that with creativity and with imagination. And this is what's fostered in the liberal arts, and it's in this that the freedom is found. And so looking back, in order to move forward, we find the seven liberal arts, the educational model that built Western civilization. And we want to build on that same foundation. And so we'll begin tonight with where it begins, in the trivium. We'll begin with grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. So let's ask ourselves some simple questions. First of all, what is grammar? Highlighted grammar. Grammar is the memorization of the basics, the rudiments, the facts, the data of anything in creation. This strengthens the student's brain by straining it a little more each day. So even in the grammar stage, with your little ones memorizing their facts, it is training their brain to learn, packing just a little more in the next day. It is acquiring a skill of learning, not merely the content of their history sentences and their multiplication facts and their timeline song. It's training their brain to memorize. And at the same time that they're being trained to memorize, they're taking in quality content that informs an educated person. And speaking of content, this is one of the beauties of classical conversations, that what our 4-year-olds and our 5-year-olds are learning is a foundation, right? We call it foundations. It's a foundation that they'll build upon all the way through high school. And so instead of piecemealing it, one of the things I love about classical conversations is that we're no longer piecemealing home education. What do we do next year? I don't know. What do you want to do next year? I don't know. What should we do next year? No, my 4-year-old is learning what they need to know in order to build later on when they get to high school. That the content is an integrated K4 through 12th grade curriculum. I can't imagine who wouldn't want that. I love it. And due to the fact that we're finite creatures, we can't learn everything by the time we graduate 12th grade anyway, right? And so the content can't be the extent of what an education is. I went forward one, sorry. The content can't be the extent because we're finite and we can only learn so much. So the fact that we cannot study it all is also why we're emphasizing the tools of learning. That's why the grammar is the beginning of training the brain to retain. Catchy, huh? Since one curriculum cannot cover all the material there is to know, we provide students with the skills to learn any subject whatsoever. The content is the opportunity to teach the skill of memorization as much as it is the memorizing of the facts themselves. And when it comes to the memorizing, as opposed to thinking that there's a drudgery to the monotony, I don't know about your kids, especially my little ones, but there's no drudgery whatsoever to doing the timeline song again, especially if you do it a little louder the second time. G.K. Chesterton encapsulated this gift that God has given to children in his book Orthodoxy. He was speaking specifically about liturgy and worship and the repetition of the liturgy in Christian worship. But I think it applies in the same exact way to what we're looking at in the grammar stage. And so this is a quote from G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, "Do it again," and the grown-up person does it again until he's nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, "Do it again" to the sun, and every evening, "Do it again" to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that He has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. The grown-up person does it again until he's nearly dead. So to summarize the grammar stage of the trivium, it's the memorization of the basics, the rudiments, the facts, the data of anything in creation. And it is to lay a strong foundation of knowledge that can be built upon throughout the high school years. Classical Conversations has an event called Windows into Challenge. And should you want to know more about how the grammar years are foundational and how they're actually fleshed out through the challenge years, talk to your support manager about scheduling a Windows into Challenge event. It spends an hour specifically going through how the foundations years are implemented in the challenge years. Very inspiring for what you're doing now if you wonder, why in the world are we doing this right now? All right, we'll move to the dialectic stage of the trivium. The dialectic stage is characterized by students who ask why. Students who want to dialogue, analyze, evaluate, and compare. The arts of evaluation, correct argumentation and logic, writing for explanation and analysis, and the art of asking better questions. A grammar student might simply memorize the facts or the definitions, but a dialectic student would want to understand what those definitions mean or why they work that way. And there's no set age that this begins to happen. I'm sure you have little ones that ask why. But what Dorothy Sayers was saying in her essay, the insight, is that to apply the memorization of the facts to the younger children is to cater to a propensity that they already have naturally. And so when the young ones are learning the grammar facts and they love singing it again and doing it again, well, that's a gift from God to those little ones. And so we're capitalizing on that gift. And so as they get older, you'll notice as your kids get older going through, toward the end of the essential years and they're still doing their timeline song, it becomes tedious. They're growing older. And now they're wanting more depth. They're wanting more substance. And so the questions get deeper. And so as that naturally happens through the course of childhood development, we want to capitalize on it. And so as children enter the 6th, 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade years, this dialectic stage is what we're looking at for them, to where we teach the art of logic, of correct thinking, of good rational thinking, foundations of argumentation, so that they can develop understanding of the knowledge that they acquired in the grammar stage. G.K. Chesterton once again said, "People quarrel because they do not know how to argue." And until him, I never thought there's a difference. But I think I'm beginning to see what he's saying, that a quarrel has no foundation. A quarrel is two people yapping at each other emotionally. But an argument, that can help the world. A finely honed argument with good, strong, rational answers, that can be a help. And so we know that kids know how to quarrel, but when they develop the skills to learn logic and to think more analytically, well, then we teach them those skills. And you may get a little bit coming back at you sometimes as a parent when you're accused of an ad hominem argument or something, but that's okay, you're still a parent. You can say, sit down. And you can threaten them with an ad baculum argument, which is a spanking. Yeah. But no, we want them to know the tools of logic, once again, so that their mind is freed from anybody coming along and saying, hey, guess what? I've got a great idea. And they're like, oh, what is it? Tell me, tell me, tell me. And then they follow along after the guy with the Kool-Aid, right? We want them to know how to think well. And God made them to grow into the dialectic stage. And so we want to foster that in our preteens. This is a quote from Stratford Caldecott about these deeper questions. No preface. Here's the quote. "It's no wonder that students come to a college education expecting nothing more than a set of paper qualifications that will enable them to earn a decent salary. The idea that they might be there to grow as human beings, to be inducted into an ancient culture, to become somehow more than they are already, is alien to them. They expect instant answers, but they have no deep questions. The great questions have not been woken in them. The process of education requires us to become open, receptive, curious, and humble in the face of what we do not know. The world is a fabric woven of mysteries, and a mystery is a provocation to our humanity that cannot be dissolved by Googling a few more bits of information." The easy answers are on Google, right? You need to know when somebody was born or when somebody died, or what town they were born in, or a list of their discography, or what movies they were in, right? There's data. I'm thankful for the internet, and the data is good. I use it all the time. But you cannot get to wisdom by Googling a few more bits of information. It takes a spirit that is prompted to ask the deeper questions. And we foster this in the dialectic stage. It is the beautiful art of question asking. So here's a little spreadsheet of the classical trivium. Moving on toward rhetoric, we have the grammar stage, the acquisition of knowledge; the dialectic stage, the beginnings and the maturation, to a certain extent, of understanding, which is all necessary to get us to the rhetoric stage, which is fostering, hoping to instill and cultivate wisdom in our young people. The rhetoric stage is the stage where the students know enough grammar and understand it well enough that they can talk and write about it. That's the grammar stage. The rhetoric stage. The art of rhetoric refers to the techniques of writing and speaking well. And this can be a little confusing because rhetoric's being used a little bit in two different ways. So the rhetoric stage is our high schoolers after acquiring the grammar, learning the art, the beginnings of the art of good, deep question asking. Then we get to the rhetoric stage where our teenagers are so often most interested in presenting themselves, concerned with what others think about them, concerned with how what they do is affecting those that are around them. And so once again, we want to teach with the grain of the childhood development. And so we foster this in the rhetoric stage, in the high school years, by granting them every opportunity available to present themselves, with an interest in helping them to present themselves well, which is the art of rhetoric, writing and speaking well, eloquently, persuasively, with conviction and good information and good logic. Rhetoric refers to the practice of very specific skills in order to be the most persuasive in expressing truth and goodness and beauty. We have some catalogs here tonight, and there are two articles that I would highly recommend on the rhetoric in that. One by Kate Deddens called "Why Write? Rhetoric Across the Curriculums," where she talks about rhetoric in each of the subject areas. You think of writing and you think of public speaking, but how the art of rhetoric applies to math and to science and to history and to Latin. Real good article. And then there's also "What is Rhetoric?" by Jennifer Courtney, going more through classical rhetoric and the art of persuasion. And so if you want to pick up a catalog and read those two articles, it will flesh out a lot of what we're not saying at the moment on rhetoric. In my comments previously about the liberal arts providing freedom, we need to note that I'm not just talking about an education that provides political or merely vocational freedom. The inheritance that we're passing on to our children is a Christian inheritance. And Christianity is not a political party. It does not begin nor end with the state, but it does begin and end with a king, a benevolent king who gives good gifts to his people. And through Jesus Christ, we receive the gift of peace, lasting peace with God. And with it, he gives joy, the joy of being in communion with God through Jesus Christ. And so that's why Classical Conversations doesn't stop at classical, but that the second of the 3 C's is Christian. We are a classical Christian community. And like the term classical, we can't assume that everyone everywhere automatically knows what we mean when we say Christian. The meaning of a term is determined by its use. So we'll look for a few minutes at least at how we use it, at how I use it, especially in applied to Classical Conversations. And this word has many different uses. In fact, some people will complain about the word Christian because it doesn't just mean as tightly a box definition as they'd like. But we're going to look at 2 of the uses of this very diverse term. Tonight we're going to look at the fact that Christian or Christianity can be used both inclusively and exclusively. So Classical Conversations is Christian. In its exclusive use, Christian makes a distinction between all the religions on earth that worship false gods and the single religion that worships the one true and living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, through the Son, Jesus Christ. Therefore, Christianity is not Islam. Christianity is not Judaism. Christianity is not Buddhism, nor is it Hinduism, nor Taoism, nor humanism. So when it comes to the worship of God, or to the worship of dumb idols, Christianity is a mutually exclusive term. And it stands in antithesis to any idea, anywhere, any opinion ever formulated against the one true and living God. By grace, through faith, we worship Him. And outside of Christianity, no one else does. Or to quote C.S. Lewis again, there is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God and counterclaimed by Satan. However, the word Christian is also used inclusively. Christianity includes all of those who worship the true and living God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, through the Son, Jesus Christ, having been baptized in that triune name. Your particular brand of Christianity, my particular brand of Christianity, does not get you in with God. It's the person and work of Jesus Christ, applied by His Holy Spirit, that redeems you from your bondage to sin, grafts you into the family of God, forgives your sin and makes your dead soul alive. His mercy endures forever for all kinds of folks from all kinds of denominational backgrounds. So in this sense, Christian is also an inclusive term. And though that list on the board, on the slide, has various and sundry doctrinal statements that would be contained within it, what I'm saying tonight is not to say that doctrine is superfluous, but it is to say that no single denomination is going to have all orthodox doctrines in their absolutely perfect proportions and applications everywhere, all of the time. And this is one of the extraordinary benefits of Classical Conversations ecumenism. Like many, Classical Conversations wants to be exclusive where God says that be exclusive. And we want to be inclusive where God says to be inclusive. Because the one who says, do not love the world or the things of the world, also says, love the brethren. Which leads us to the brethren, which leads us to community. Classical Conversations is a classical Christian community. To me, this is the gem. This is the pièce de résistance. This is the arkenstone of Classical Conversations. The fact that that we are in this thing together. Because neither of the two preceding aspects, neither Christian nor classical, were designed to be, nor can they be done well in solitude, alone. They can't be accomplished. We're going to look back at those two other facets, at classical and at Christian, and look at them in light of being together in community. We'll begin with the latter aspect first, Christian. Particular Christians exist as individuals. To explain, it's pretty hard stuff. You ready, Caleb? I am me. You are you. I am not you. And you are not me. Got it? Yeah, powerful stuff. So particular Christians live and move and have their being as particular individuals. But when we think of ourselves as individuals, we need to think of ourselves as individual members of a body, because that's how the Word of God refers to us. And we're going to read a section from 1 Corinthians 12 to make sure we got this. We are individuals, but we need to make sure we're thinking of ourselves as individual members of a body. 1 Corinthians, a portion of 1 Corinthians 12. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, well, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an ear, I don't belong to the body, well, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in one body, each one of them as He chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. From 1 Corinthians 12. I am an individual member. I'm an individual, but I'm not the entire body. I may be an eye, you may be an ear. The point is that we need each other in order to be whole. And Jesus Christ is the head of this one body, for she really is one bride. Jesus is not a polygamist, marrying millions of individuals all throughout history. He's marrying one bride, one holy church. When we look at God, we see that He is one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Jesus Christ is one Son, but He has two natures, human and divine. And similarly, not exactly, but similarly, the church is one bride from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues. And the church is only, maybe say, analogically, or metaphorically similar to God in this sense, because the Father is 100% God, the Son is 100% God, the Spirit is 100% God. Jesus is fully man and fully divine, whereas the church is composed of parts. God is not composed of parts. Jesus is not composed of parts. But what we can take away from this, although that's not a direct correspondence, is that there has never been any such thing as rugged individualism in heaven or on earth. God has always been in eternal community as a Trinity, and He designed us to be in community. There's never been any such thing as rugged individualism. Classical conversations is. As Christians, if we see ourselves rightly, we will not despise the brethren by thinking that we're fine on our own and they're fine on their own. We will love and serve and minister to one another. We will use our freedom as individuals for the building up of the body instead of exploiting our freedom on ourselves. We will love our neighbor as ourselves by freely laying down our lives in service to one another. And this mutual Christian one anothering happens at our local Christian congregations, at the churches of which we are members. But it doesn't just happen on Sundays, right? It happens between members throughout the week. But it also happens between Christians throughout the week. as Christians from many congregations will have opportunity to minister to one another throughout the week. And Classical Conversations is one example of this one anothering throughout the week. We may be from many different congregations, but yet we have the opportunity to come together on the community day and minister to one another. Classical Conversations loves the body of Christ. Classical Conversations exists to minister to the body of Christ, both present and future. And Classical Conversations recognizes this mutual need between Christians, encourages mutual care, and facilitates it through our local CC communities. Christianity is not meant to be accomplished alone, and neither is classical education. So the first aspect that we covered in this classical is nigh unto impossible to do well in seclusion. And we'll lay that out here as we wrap up. Christianity is not meant, if we define classical education as an education that applies and integrates the three arts of the trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, to those same three stages of childhood, then it becomes evident that no one can do this well on his or her own. And so we'll ask ourselves some questions about grammar and dialectic and rhetoric. Is the art of grammar better in community? Well, let's ask ourselves a different question to start out with. Is the opposite possible? Is it possible to practice the art of grammar alone? Yeah, I think so. You can be at home and you can order DVDs and you can practice your timeline and the whole point of it is that we do it at home, right? All of the grammar can be memorized at home. And so what's the benefit of coming together for the grammar stage? I'll start out with it's a whole lot of fun. Secondly, we have the accountability of ministering to one another to where not only our kids have assignments to bring with them, memory work that was supposed to be done, but we as parents have kids that have assignments to bring with them. And so the accountability between parents and parents is just as strong as the accountability between students and other students. And home education is not all daisies and tulips, right? I mean, there are times when classical education is hard, when home education is hard, when parenting is hard. And so the aspect of community to come together to minister to one another when we're struggling with the grammar stage, well, then you have that too. As it says, as the scriptures say in Ecclesiastes, two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. It is better to do it together. Let's go to dialectic. Is the art of dialectic better in community? Let's go back to our circumstance question. Is it possible or impossible to practice the art of dialectic? Did I say rhetoric? I meant dialectic. To practice the art of dialectic at home. Is it possible to do dialectic at home? Yes, I think it is. Here's why. For example, can we practice dialectic when we're reading? Can we ask ourselves questions while we're reading? Well, the good reader ought to be asking themselves questions 100% of the time, right? A good reader is always reading dialectically. A good reader is going to endeavor to suspend final judgment until he's finished the entire argument in order to judge the text rightly. And I've heard this being called academically honest with the text. If we want to give the author a chance, then we have to read his entire argument and suspend some belief, suspend some judgment until he's done, right? This is the art of dialectic when you're alone. I guess you're completely alone, though, because the author is kind of there with you. But anyway, you're not in community. You're reading by yourself. But at the same time as you can practice the art of dialectic alone when you're reading, the words only have meaning as they're sifted and sorted through your present paradigm of the world, right? So even one who's attempting to be academically honest with the text must recognize his own present personal biases. So as a reader, I'm judging every sentence while I'm endeavoring to suspend final judgment until the end. What about a good writer? Do you practice the art of dialectic when you're writing? Yes. A good writer is always writing dialectically because these same questions are going to be going through their mind. In essence, there's going to be an invisible person right there with them, or maybe across the table from them the entire time. Because for any assertion that you make when you're writing your paper, you must imagine, well, what would somebody say to that? What if I were to say this? What would somebody say back to me? So you're having an imaginary conversation, in a sense, right? An imaginary dialectic in order to write well, in order to write something that's going to communicate effectively. However, as both a reader and a writer, my personal dialectic will come to a grinding halt before I have thoroughly mined the depths of any subject. The lenses through which I see the world will eventually inhibit instead of promote a fully mature dialectic. To begin to plumb the glories, the depths of the handiwork of God, I'm going to need another image bearer alongside me. I need help. I need a conversation. A conversation. That's a great name for an educational organization. No, that's why it's in the name, right? Classical Conversations. Why is it in the name? Of the two most important words they could pick, they put that one in there. Because in order to mature beyond your own limitations, you need somebody to challenge you. You need somebody to say, oh yeah, what if? Or somebody to say, wait a minute, that was a logical fallacy. You can't even prove your point based on that. You need somebody that's going to be coming back at you in order to mature in the dialectic stage. And the glories is that these are what the students are beginning in junior high. In 7th and 8th grade, they're beginning the art of dialectic with this question and answer. And then they mature in it for the next 6 years and on past that. So is the dialectic better in community? You betcha. You betcha. What about the art of rhetoric? Is it better in community? Let's go back to our question. Is it possible or impossible to practice the art of rhetoric alone? Well, if the art of rhetoric is the art of persuasion aimed at the truth, it's barely possible alone. In fact, probably the only thing you can do alone would be to rehearse the art of rhetoric, to get ready for when you're really going to do it. Because I'd say it's nigh to impossible to persuade anybody of anything if they're not there listening to you. Yeah, sounds pretty impossible. Public speaking requires a public. Being a persuader requires a persuadee. Like an athlete, you have to be in a real game. You can practice your free throws forever at home outside your garage, but you'll never know if you can really do it until you're in a real game. You don't get points outside your garage at home. It takes being able to do it on the line when there's pressure, right? It takes athletes that are with you, a team that's encouraging you and supporting you, motivating you, that's working with you, and it takes a team that's working against you, right? Real rhetoric requires a persuadee, somebody that's coming back at you like an athlete and saying, oh, no, you don't. And so the art of rhetoric requires chutzpah. And I Googled that. That's how you're supposed to spell it. And that doesn't come from rehearsing in the mirror, right? Real rhetoric requires the sharpening of iron by iron. And so Classical Conversations is a classical Christian community. In our continuing endeavor to educate our children, not a single one of the 3 C's is negotiable. They're like legs on a stool. 2 just doesn't cut it. We must be classical, looking back in order to move forward. We must be Christian, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And we must do this together in community if we are ever to attain to this noble and holy calling. Thank you.